Let's get some reaction, bringing in Chief Executive of the South African Institute of International Affairs, Elizabeth Sidiropoulos, who joins us for more. A very good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time. What is your reaction as you listen to President Cyril Ramaphosa's perspective around the G20? I mean, he speaks about alleviating poverty, he speaks about food security, and really looking at the most vulnerable in society.
Well, it's not surprising. Very similarly to Brazil, we face the challenges of poverty, hunger, inequality. These are also very fundamentally developmental issues, which the last three G20 presidencies, which were all presidencies from the global south, so Indonesia, India, and Brazil, have highlighted. They've wanted to bring back development into the center of the G20, and I think over the last 3 years that has happened, and South Africa is building on that legacy. That was the point that South Africa has made in its discussions and preparations over the course of the year, that we want to build up momentum on what has already gone before. And so the socioeconomic issues, the issue of we're going to be 5 years away from the Agenda 2030, from the Sustainable Development Goals. These have to be front and center in the way in which global governance, of which the G20 is an important enabler, has to focus on. And fundamentally, of course, the issue of global financial architecture. When we talk about socioeconomic issues, developmental issues, these are significantly impacted by the extent to which the international financial architecture can help us to finance many of the developmental objectives that are set out both in the SDGs and indeed, if we talk about Africa and Agenda 2063.
How should the responsibility of the presidency of the G20, I mean, as of next year, but the 1st of December, benefit South Africa, considering that the challenges that President Ramaphosa was speaking of are not far off from what is happening in his own backyard here in South Africa? Poverty, food security, those are issues that one can relate to when it comes to your own country. So how should this platform benefit South Africa?
So as with Brazil and with the other previous presidencies, the way in which the agenda is crafted reflects the important priorities of a domestic nature. Mm-hmm. And what I think South Africa has done in developing its priorities, which the president identified as being around inequality, employment, inclusive economic growth, food security, and also innovation and artificial intelligence. The way in which you identify those priorities needs to reflect your domestic situation, your domestic concerns. In the case of South Africa, there's also been a reflection and a consideration of African concerns, and then, of course, the global. A lot of these issues have a very clear domestic policy implication, but they're also affected by what happens in the global arena. So we can take certain decisions around domestic resource mobilization, for example, but if the global tax system is such that it enables multinational corporations to evade tax or to not pay their dues in countries in which their revenue is generated, for example, or if the way in which debt restructuring happens at the global level is such that, in Africa, 23 African countries spend more on debt servicing annually than they spend on health and education. That's where the way in which the G20 can address some of these very domestic problems by looking at the global can have an impact. And I think South Africa is looking at that interface between the domestic policy environment, but also how that is impacted by the way in which the rules of global governance are structured. And at the end of the day, the G20 is first and foremost a grouping, an informal grouping that aims to address global economic governance issues. It had posited itself from 2008 when it was elevated to a summit as the premier forum for global economic governance. And global economic governance sometimes sounds a little rarefied, but it has very real domestic impacts on developing economies. The same can be said around climate finance, for example, and your ability or lack thereof to not only source sufficient finance, but that finance must be of the kind of quality that actually doesn't increase your debt, but actually enables you to move forward with your development objectives.
As we reflect on 1,000 days of Russia's invasion on Ukraine, there have been suggestions that South Africa's leadership of the G20 will not succeed without engagement with Ukraine. I mean, that's really just looking at how important that aspect will be for South Africa. What are your thoughts around those engagements?
So I think it's very interesting to look at the Rio de Janeiro declaration that came out late last night, to actually see how the language around Ukraine has actually changed. Now, that has been a hot issue and issue certainly in Indonesia in 2022, where right up to the wire, it was really difficult to agree on a text, get everybody to agree on a text. There were also similar challenges during the Indian presidency, but in both cases, these were overcome. And looking at the Brazilian declaration, the Rio Declaration, I think that language has been softened. In the first instance, the declaration refers to recognizing that the countries around the table have different national positions. But the emphasis has been really in this declaration on the impact of the war on food security, on humanitarian issues, on energy supplies, and the importance of really moving and exploring all peaceful measures that can bring about a resolution to the conflict. And I think this will probably, so in many ways, I think the difficulties that both Indonesia and India experienced with Ukraine will probably be less so in the case of the South African presidency. I think what will be the big challenge for South Africa, and one that it'll have to navigate very diplomatically as the chair, because it's about the chair has a responsibility to build consensus, is of course the way in which the United States under a Trump administration may engage on many of these issues on the G20 agenda that are fundamentally about cooperation. And about sort of give and take and about compromise. And I think that's where the biggest challenge will lie in the year ahead.
Very well. Thank you so much for weighing in on this discussion. We are going to have to leave it there for now. Speaking there to Chief Executive of the South African Institute of International Affairs, Elizabeth Sidiropoulos.